Welcome to the Two Blokes Chatting radio show on 94.7 The Pulse. Music, interviews, news and, well, Two Blokes Chatting. Now, here are the two blokes.
On the line, we were going to have a Victorian representative netballer and an Australian basketballer and a person who represented Australia in snowboarding, and we thought we'd get them to do some competitive skiing and potentially some competitive athletics in javelin and long jump. And then we thought, no, actually we should get someone who's actually a world champion and world record holder on bicycling, and then someone who does a bit of rowing, and also a qualified osteopath, and maybe a board member for Vision 2020. Got all those people together, and they're about to talk to you right now. Good morning, Jess.
Good morning.
Jess Gallagher. Ordinary sounding CV for mine.
Yes, it is.
What do you do in your spare time, Jess?
Pardon?
What do you do in your spare time?
Well, just enjoy it when I have it.
That is an amazing. So congratulations, firstly, on what you've done. But let's lead in and find out a little bit about obviously a massive change in your life when you are a Paralympian, because you have issues with your sight, and it wasn't something you were born with. It happened later in your life. Just go through that period for us.
Yeah, so a Geelong girl, grew up in Geelong and played a lot of sport, and it wasn't until year 12 when I started experiencing some migraines, and I suppose I'd had glasses most of my high school years, and just sort of thought, like most kids, that there were some things that were a bit harder to see than others, and it wasn't really until the pain started with the migraines that we decided to further investigate it, because we'd kept being told by the optometrist that the glasses would fix the problems that I was having with my vision, and as it turned out, there was something a little bit more sinister going on with an eye disease, which is genetic. I'm the first in my family to have it, so it had existed since birth, but it had deteriorated, and as I'd gotten older, it had gotten worse, and so it wasn't until that sort of real formative years of being in year 12 that it really came to a head, and was at the point of me being classified as legally blind.
So did the transition period go from quite comfortable in vision at the age of 17 to what period of time before you're at the state now? And I imagine the state you're in now won't get any worse than this, or is it a continuing deterioration?
It's a continuing deterioration, so it is a degenerative condition, but because it's quite rare, specialists can't really give you a prognosis. So I've been very fortunate that over the past 15 years since the diagnosis, it has remained fairly stable and has only deteriorated a couple of degrees. So I wouldn't really describe the time as a transition, because it just, it wasn't as though one day I woke up and I couldn't see anything. For me, it was just this real gradual decline, and as I mentioned, the pain was kind of what really gave us the clue that there was something a little bit else going on. So, it was a really difficult time, as you can imagine. I had just returned from the national netball titles representing Victoria, where I was a goaler, and to be sat down by an eye specialist to be told that you were actually legally blind was a pretty big shock to the system. But, I guess because it wasn't that huge sort of waking up in the morning and all of a sudden I couldn't see, it was more of a, well, this is what I've been experiencing, so how do we move on from this and move forward?
And often, like, we've spoken to a couple of Paralympians in the last couple of weeks, and they've generally, something has happened, like an incident, a traumatic event has occurred. But in your case, you've just sort of, it's one of those things, a bit like, obviously, a significantly more serious version of how people's eyesight starts to diminish as they get older.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone's vision does get worse as we get older. Mine just started a few decades before most people.
Now, we've got about 9 million things we could talk about in about 6 minutes that we've got left, so we might have to get you back to talk about some of this stuff. But transition into Paralympic sport, 2008 Beijing, thought you'd give that a bit of a crack. What's going on there?
Yeah, so it actually took 4 or 5 years before somebody told me that Paralympic sport existed. So, 10 10, 15 years ago, Paralympic sports certainly didn't have the mainstream coverage that it does now. And despite being in the junior elite sporting pathways of both netball and basketball, with Netball Victoria, Basketball Victoria and the national organisations, no one had actually mentioned that, now that I was classified as a person with a disability, that I could move into this thing called Paralympic sports. So it was quite a random discovery, and, certainly has changed my life forever. And Beijing was the first Paralympics that I attended, and was due to compete in track and field. And during the Paralympic process, you have what's called classification, and that's where you receive tests to ensure that you're eligible to compete and of a similar level playing field. So there are different classification groups for the vision impaired athletes, amputees, wheelchair athletes, and so on. And so I had those tests done, and unfortunately one of my eyes was deemed too eligible by 0.01%. And so I was actually banned from competing at those games, which was a pretty traumatising experience.
With the CV that Neil mentioned, so many different sports, without being flippant about it, are they sports you'd all experienced when you were in full sight and wanted to revisit them, or it was a case of, well, what can I do next? Where can I take this next?
Yeah, I hadn't actually competed in any of the sports before I took them up. So I suppose one of the real challenges as a vision impaired athlete is that in a lot of the sports at Paralympic level, you do require the use of a guide or a pilot or a sighted assistant. And so for me, I haven't sort of been flippant and just kind of changed sports because I could. It's usually been through a circumstance outside of my control, which has put a stop to the pathway that I'm on. So I'd never skied before, but I had snowboarded, and so that was sort of, I suppose, an easier transition. But I'd certainly never ridden a track bike when I took up the sport of track cycling. And then the reason that I left athletics, which was my very first Paralympic event, was because they removed my event from the Paralympic Games. And so as a female vision impaired long jumper, it was decided that event would be removed. And that happens, every now and then in Paralympic sport, just like we see in the Olympics. Sports and events come in and out of the Games as the Games evolve and changes. And so it does happen to athletes, and unfortunately I just happen to be one of those. And it's put me on the pathway of a pretty, unique and special career, because I've made the decision to try and transition and see if I can still get to the Games and fulfil my goals. They just look a little bit differently to what I thought they would.
Jess, the stuff that you've done, I can sort of comprehend someone visually impaired could do, except the skiing, the downhill skiing. I just sense danger. How does the sighted assistant make you capable of doing this incredibly difficult task?
Yeah, so a ski guide will ski 7 to 10 metres in front of me, and they'll wear a fluorescent vest so that I can use the vision that I do have to see their outline. And then inside of our helmets, we actually wear Bluetooth earpieces, and we have a little microphone in front of our mouth, and so that provides, Bluetooth audio communication to one another. And so the guide will provide that audio feedback as we're heading down the mountain at over 100 kilometres an hour. So it's pretty cool.
I told you she's nuts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's an element of nuts to that sport anyway, but you've added another layer. Do you really get a buzz out of that exhilaration?
Oh, absolutely, and that's what I say to people. I understand that it's crazy, but it's the same adrenaline rush that anybody would have, whether you have vision or not. It's all relative and perspective. I think jumping out of a plane is a bit nuts, but, I'll throw myself down a mountain at fast speed. So it's certainly the same adrenaline rush, and it makes it quite addictive, the feeling.
Jess, we're desperately short of time because we've got to go to an Anzac event. Can we get you back another weekend to have a chat about your Paralympic and your World Championship experience?
Sure,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Just to put this in context, Jess is the only athlete in Australia who has won both winter and summer Paralympic/Olympic medals. She's also a world champion on a different sport and a world record holder in a different sport, and now she's on another sport trying to get into the next Paralympic Games.
Yeah.
Extraordinary. Jess, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm a big fan, and we'll get back to you in the next couple of weeks if we can't talk through some of those games.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Jess.